Good afternoon to you. Happy 4th of July as well. I'm Danilo Evangelista. Welcome to our tropical weather outlook for today, July 4th, 2024, Independence Day in the United States, as most of you probably from the United States are. Hope you're having a great day today. We're going over Hurricane Beryl today, which is now, for once, for the first time in what seems like a long time now, it is now weakened below major hurricane status, but the impacts are still not over for Beryl. We're watching it potentially going to make landfall as a hurricane on the Yucatan Peninsula tomorrow morning, early tomorrow morning, and then we're watching potential implications for the Texas Gulf Coast and the northern Mexico Gulf Coast as well on Hurricane Beryl. Once this moves into the Gulf, we're gonna talk about what to expect from Beryl now over the next 12 to 24 hours, and what that will mean for the Gulf Coast, probably in the next 3 or 4 days or so. So let's get started right now with the first update on Hurricane Beryl as a Category 2 storm for the first time in 5 days since it became a major hurricane. As of the latest 2 p.m. update, 110 miles per hour, so it is a high-end Category 2, minimum central pressure of 974 millibars. So this storm continues to weaken as expected, but it is not as weakening as fast as expected. Especially the models, and I'll also show you that later on, but the models really thought that this would weaken more, but Hurricane Beryl continues to hold on strong, and that will definitely have implications on how it will behave once it gets into the Gulf. It is located right now at 19.2 north with a longitude of 83.4 west, and it is moving now west-northwest, still pretty fast at 18 miles per hour, but is definitely beginning to slow down as time goes on. And then you can obviously see the 2 p.m. update, the center of Beryl moving across the northwestern Caribbean. Strong winds and dangerous storm surge and damaging waves are expected on the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico by early Friday. And that's the first sort of thing we got to watch out for with Beryl right now, is the impacts it will have to the Yucatan. I'm going to really quickly load a new satellite of Beryl, and you could see it's definitely weakening still, but it's actually improved a little bit on the satellite this morning. The shear, as we talked about, that has been pounding Beryl for the last 2 or 3 days as it was passing near Jamaica, it is now beginning to slowly lighten up, and you do see that this storm is generally beginning to gain its structure and its shape again. But the recon is still going in and finding that Beryl is weakening winds and pressure-wise at this time, and you could definitely see why. We have these convective bursts associated with Beryl, but they're not quite wrapping around the full storm, and once that happens, then we'll probably see Beryl begin to strengthen again, and the H-Wharf does actually indicate potentially, and I think some of the other hurricane models too, that within the last several hours before it makes landfall in the Yucatan, it might try to regain some intensity, just a little bit, but we'll have to see about it. But regardless, heavy rains continue over the portions of the northwestern Caribbean. It did make a close approach to the Cayman Islands this morning. Didn't quite get the eye wall on the Cayman Islands. I think there was a hurricane warning for them, but they spared most of the actual hurricane winds, so that is good. But there's still a lot of convective activity going on over the Caymans right now. There's probably still lots of heavy rains occurring, and also for Cuba as well. And we actually have a radar loop out of the Cayman Islands this afternoon. You could see, still some showers and thunderstorms occurring over the Caymans right now. Now just going to happen in sort of pockets and bands now that Beryl is moving off to the west-northwest. And you could also see Cuba on the general top right, or top left, I should say, also getting the outer fringes of Beryl right now. But the most important part about Beryl is the fact that it still is holding on its inner structure, despite the fact that it's going through so much shear and dry air that has been impacting the storm and will continue to try to do so over the next several days. Up until this gets to the Yucatan, the shear is actually going to become less of a dry air. But as I was trying to say, I should have said that shear, especially over the last several days, has really been impacting the storm. Dry air too, and a lot of the hurricane models really thought that this would cause Beryl to weaken and in some cases completely lose its actual structure. But as you can see on the radar as well, um, it actually is still holding its structure pretty well. You can still see that there's parts of the eye wall still intact with Beryl. In fact, it seems like on the later frames, it seems like the entire eye wall is trying to come back with Beryl, and it'll really depend on whether or not it's able to maintain a full eye wall in terms of whether or not it will intensify again. But that will also have implications on the track too, because we have seen that because of this sort of regaining and sort of re-energizing of the eye wall, especially by convective bursts throughout the day, you could actually see maybe a little bit that it did take quite a bit of a northwestern jog, or at least it was noted by a lot of people that Beryl did take quite a bit of a northwestern jog earlier today. Looks like in recent frames it's starting to go a little bit back towards the west, and recon is also indicating that as well. But I mention that because that'll be really important, especially for what impacts it'll have to the Yucatan Peninsula, given if it's able to intensify again or not, but also, of course, where in the Yucatan exactly it'll make landfall in, because we always want to know the exact landfall location. But obviously, I should mention there are hurricane warnings in effect for basically the entire portion of the Mexico part of the Yucatan Peninsula. Basically, it seems like from the Belize border, maybe around that area, right up into the northern part of the Yucatan, there's a hurricane warning. There's also some warnings and watches in effect for Belize as well. And then there's also tropical storm warnings in effect for the northern tier of the Yucatan Peninsula, and then also into the Bay of Campeche too. But it's really going to depend, of course, these wobbles that we see from north to south over the next several hours, because not only will that have implications on where this makes landfall in the Yucatan, but that's also going to have implications on how long it stays over the Yucatan Peninsula, and potentially how much it'll track north or south in the Gulf of Mexico, which down the line it'll have an impact on where we see landfall in Texas too, which we've been getting a lot more certainty from the models over the last several days, or the last day or so, that we're starting to hone in probably on the far northeastern Mexico, maybe Mexico-Texas border sort of landfall situation with Beryl. And you can actually see that on the model guidance as of 12Z, a lot of them starting to hone in on northern Mexico or southern Texas. But because we're also talking about southern Texas, there's still lots of uncertainty in terms of its actual landfall location. We still have some models bringing this all the way into the Texas coastline, and probably that, especially this model right here, I'm not sure which one it is, and even the H-Wharf and the GFS. The GFS actually brings this, that's the red track, it brings it right into the Texas-Mexico border, while we have models like the UK Met and the European bringing this still further south. But there's still lots of uncertainty over the next several days on how much Beryl will intensify, especially due to how much it lasts over the Yucatan, and that'll also have an impact on where in either northern Mexico or maybe southern Texas it makes landfall. And Eric Webb did actually bring that up in a tweet this morning. He mentioned Hurricane Beryl's long-term potential for making landfall on the U.S. Texas coast in several days is very dependent on its intensity, but also potential downshear tugging or reformation of the center. This kind of downshear, or tugging as he's calling it, of center reformations is often poorly forecasted and is usually underestimated by most of the models. And then he points out as well that Beryl is generally following the northern end of the guidance envelope this morning. That's what this graphic is for. You can see that's Beryl, and you can see the eye is roughly there. And I think this is the GFS model plots. And notice where Beryl is compared to all of the model ensembles from the GFS. It's on the far northern side, And he mentions as well, it's plausible to think at least one of these downshear tugs has occurred since yesterday, as we just went over, which explains why the models are potentially struggling to handle its short-term track, which is why it'll really, that part right there, especially that it's having a struggle on where it's going to make landfall, is why there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. And especially if we're talking about a specific location for landfall, that means lots of uncertainty on where exactly it'll hit, if it's going to be in northern Mexico or southern Texas. And obviously there's a huge sort of question on whether or not this will make landfall on the Texas side of the border, obviously. That'll, and as Eric Webb mentioned, it's really going to depend on how strong Beryl stays through the Yucatan, which will depend on whether or not this continues to shift towards the northern end of the guidance, or will it or maybe if it continues to weaken enough that it kind of starts following the more southern trend of the guidance, and as a result we start seeing a little bit more of a southwestern or a southern sort of shift. I think it's southwestern, but so I'm just going to call it generally a more southern solution that brings us more or less into the northeastern Mexico. So let's actually review that on the models. Let me bring this back on the GFS. The 12Z GFS today has it. And we talked about before how the GFS has not really done well with its intensity, so I wouldn't really focus on the exact intensity of Beryl, because obviously it is not 986 millibars at 18Z, which is 2 p.m. Eastern Time exactly on the US. It's not 986, so the GFS is already off with that. But in general, the GFS noticeably keeps the storm maintaining its strength, not weakening much, and that's probably a hurricane landfall for the Yucatan. And as a result, the GFS brings us into the Gulf, kind of has a more northern solution, and we see it right just south of the Texas-Mexico border, right around hour 90, and then it kind of lasts a little bit, and then it starts going on a more northerly track, and that'll probably, either way, that this GFS solution actually looks like it'll bring impacts to Texas no matter what, probably heavy rains and gusty winds too. Should mention that actually a lot of the models seems to have, especially with the Texas landfall, they seem to think that it'll probably get close and then it'll probably start taking a northerly shift before it actually makes landfall on the coast, which is why they then show a Texas landfall. So that is an interesting part too. What about the European model? The European kind of has a little bit more of a weaker solution, I guess, which dives it down into the central portion of the Yucatan Peninsula as 9. It's definitely weaker than the GFS, and then it has it at 989 millibars right at landfall, or probably already heading into the coast. And then obviously it lasts longer over the Yucatan Peninsula, and then it strengthens it pretty decently over the Gulf of Mexico. But obviously, since it's on the southern part, it takes a more southern solution, and that brings it into northern Mexico, and Texas is completely out of it on the European. What about the HWRF, though? Since we're talking about hurricane models, let's see what the HWRF has. Let me bring this on the MSLP and 10 millibar winds, so this way we could actually see what the wind speeds are on the models. And this is what it forecasts at 18Z. First and foremost, this is really important. HWRF right on the dot, actually, with the initialization at the 18Z time frame, which is once again 2 p.m. local time in East Coast time, and it's at 974 millibars. Wind's a little bit lower, but that doesn't matter. I think the pressure more or less matters in terms of intensity on the hurricane models. But notice what the HWRF does over the next 24 hours, 21 hours. So this is roughly tomorrow morning around, I should say, 5 to 8 a.m., approaching the northeastern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. And notice, interestingly enough, how we go from 974 millibars right now to 968 millibars right at landfall. So it seems like the HWRF is picking up a little bit on what we talked about earlier, with a potential re-intensification slightly as it approaches the Yucatan, and as a result, it obviously takes a much more northern track, moves into the Gulf of Mexico, becomes a hurricane again, and then notice what it does right at the Texas-Mexico border, 958 millibars, and that is indeed a major hurricane that is making landfall basically right at the border of Texas and Mexico, and then it kind of moves inland, and it also looks pretty large too, which that'll be an interesting factor for impacts as well. And all of the models kind of do this, where they significantly broaden out Beryl as it moves into the Gulf. And that'll also have implications as well, because that means storm surge will probably be a threat no matter what for portions of southern Texas, even if this makes landfall in extreme northeastern Mexico. And that would mean it really wouldn't matter either way if this were to make landfall in northern Mexico or Texas or not, in terms of impacts wise. And that's also something to keep in mind too. But you see that your H-Wharf takes a more northern solution, and then because of that, it strengthens this into a hurricane, and then the H-Wharf goes actually back to major hurricane intensity on approach to the Texas/northern Mexico coastline. Not sure about the major hurricane part, but as I mentioned before, and actually as the National Hurricane Center has, it looks like conditions might actually be favorable in the Gulf for potentially some re-strengthening of Beryl, and that too will also have implications on the track as well. So there's really lots to really watch in terms of wobbles and in terms of slight changes to intensity as well, which will have implications on the track, which is why no matter what, if you're in northeastern Mexico, or even if you're in southern Texas or even portions of the central Texas coastline, all of you guys should be watching Beryl as we close out the week and head into the early part of next week, because that's when it looks like this will make landfall. And also, once again, just revisiting the cone of uncertainty too, you're not supposed to focus on where the exact landfall location will be, where the exact center of all of these circles are, because the cone represents the possibility of where all of the tracks will be. And notice how much of the Texas coastline, it goes all the way up to the central Texas coastline. I got to see exactly on a map where that is, but that's a huge portion of the Texas coastline that is in the cone of uncertainty. So that means if you're in Texas, especially along the Texas Gulf Coast, you should definitely not be letting your guard down for Beryl, even northern Mexico. And if you're in the Yucatan Peninsula, you guys are on the next line of fire for Hurricane Beryl tonight. Obviously, hopefully not. It's not going to be as strong. Well, definitely not. Jamaica got it as a Category 4. Beryl is now down to a high-end Category 2, so it is definitely weakened yesterday from when it was passing by Jamaica, thank goodness. But it's still a hurricane. It is still near major hurricane intensity, and it'll probably remain that way in the very least, I would imagine, as this continues to the Yucatan Peninsula. So we got to watch that. And then obviously after that, it is watching Hurricane Beryl for the Gulf Coast, as the thumbnail title says. With that being said, obviously I have a lot more to keep on top of over the next week. Stay safe if you are new to the channel, and if you want to keep on top of this with me, get the videos that I post whenever I release them, the second I post them. Please subscribe and also like as well, and turn on the notification bell too. All of that good stuff. Stay safe. Have a great day, a blessed day to all of you. Once again, to anybody that was impacted by Hurricane Beryl so far, my heart goes out to you and your families. If your family was impacted by Beryl, but not you directly, wishing you guys all a speedy recovery, and hopefully things return to normal. Of course, that's obviously what we want, is normalcy, especially in all these areas where it is definitely not normal right now. I mean, Hurricane Beryl was not a normal storm by any stretch of the imagination at all, especially for the date, it being only July 4th, where it's not even into the peak season, nowhere near it yet. And we're already looking at a hurricane like Beryl. Just an extraordinary storm so far, and it continues to be extraordinary. And it'll probably remain to do so until it dies. And that's why we're still gonna have to watch it over the next several days. Thanks for watching. Stay safe to all of you. Peace, love, and kindness to you all once again, and we'll talk again very soon.